Okay, welcome everybody. I think we're ready to start today's session of pandemic histories. Some of you may be familiar with me by now. This is our fourth, I guess, pandemic histories event. My name is Essel Jones. I'm a professor of history at the University of Manitoba. And I'm also a part-time member of community health sciences at University of Manitoba. So I'm just moderating today our panel, Publics and Their Health, with our special guests, Mitchell Hammond, Sarah Isabelle Wallace, and James Hanley. So we'll have some short self-introductions from our panel members, and then presentations, and then a bit of dialogue between the three panelists as they talk through connections between their work. And then an opportunity for some questions to come from the audience. I'd just like to ask everybody to please use the Q&A function if you wish to ask questions, and I will moderate those to the best of my ability anyway. So we're going to start off with an introduction by James Hanley.
Hello, James Hanley. I am a professor in the history department at the University of Winnipeg. I teach in the history of science and the history of medicine. Thank you.
Sarah?
Hi, my name is Sarah Wallace, and I am a historian with the RCMP in Ottawa, but I have in recent years taught history of medicine courses at Trent University and Queen's. And I focus on the relationship between pandemics and North American health immigration policies in my work. Thank you.
Mitch.
Hello, I'm Mitchell Hammond. I'm an assistant professor in the history department at the University of Victoria, and I research public health and related topics in early modern Europe, but in recent years my interests have broadened, and I just published in January textbook Epidemics in the Modern World with the University of Toronto Press.
Okay, so I'm going to go off screen now, and James Hanley is going to give us his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Essel, for inviting me to be on this panel. And I would also like to thank the panelists in the previous 4 episodes for their presentations and discussions. I've learned much from them, especially as we think about the ways in which epidemics have been experienced in the past, and in particular, the way in which disease impacts are differentially distributed through the population along race, class, and gendered lines. Relying on my work on public health in 19th century England and Wales, and in particular on the response of various local official bodies responsible in some way for environmental control, I want to explore the way in which epidemics created new kinds of publics. Several different things were redefined in terms of their public character, like public nuisances and public services, but I want to focus today on human publics. Starting in the early post-war period with the typhus epidemic that swept through London especially, but continuing on with the cholera epidemics of 1831 and 1848 and their aftermaths, I argued that the differential incidence of disease triggered the creation of both inclusive and exclusive publics. Public health thus served as an important, if contradictory, site in the creation of these publics, enhancing the rights to health for some, while simultaneously restricting, in the name of health, the rights of others. Both phenomena are visible in London. Here, a new local public, united by the fiscal responsibility for the health of others, was created in order to finance London's main drainage system. This system, built by the Metropolitan Board of Works and operational by 1865, was and is an engineering marvel, and historians have rightly focused on the enormous technical challenges associated with building this system, but these challenges hardly exhausted the difficulties that the Metropolitan Board of Works faced. Foremost among the non-technical challenges was the inability of the Metropolitan Board of Works to finance this work. According to the law under which the Metropolitan Board of Works was created, a law that had literally hundreds of years of common law precedent behind it, there was no way for the Metropolitan Board to tax or rate the entire metropolis to pay for these works. According to the law at the time, specific sub-areas would have to pay for the costs of their own improvement. And given the social and residential differentiation across London, poor areas where epidemic disease hit hardest would have to tax their generally lower value property at a significantly higher rate than wealthy areas to obtain the same service. Had that route been followed, there's simply no question that conditions in poorer areas, and especially south of the river, would have remained much worse for longer. Effectively pooling the wealth of London's property across the metropolis on both sides of the river was a far more progressive option. The only way to tax the property of London as a whole, however, was to effect what one MP called a total revolution in the entire system of taxation of the metropolis. And that is exactly what the Metropolitan Board of Works and its local partners did in legal battles fought across numerous fronts from 1855 to 1865. In so doing, the Metropolitan Board of Works achieved a goal that its predecessor bodies had sought for decades. Since 1815, metropolitan actors of various kinds promoted the legally unprecedented idea that drainage provided not only direct benefits, property got drained and its value was increased, but also indirect benefits. And the principal indirect benefit was the health of others. Reframing the benefits of drainage in terms of people, in addition to property, effectively sanctioned a redistribution of the propertied wealth of the metropolis. Drains, as Martin Daunton noted, raised important issues of political and philosophical principle, and paying for healthy infrastructure raised fundamental questions about the nature of public goods and the costs and benefits of providing them to the public. I do not want to overstate this local collectivist, if you will, development. It only operated at the metropolitan level and provincially at the local level. It was not nationwide and it was not mandatory, and local politics were thus crucial for its implementation. In addition, public health was hardly always an inclusive force. And I want to turn now to the simultaneously exclusive nature of communities made by public health within England and Wales at this time. The division in this case was between those who had rights to privacy and familial integrity and those who didn't. And the community public health created in this case was the fluctuating body of people who were accommodated in what came to be called common lodging houses. Parliament first required the compulsory control of common lodging houses in 1851. According to the Act, police could enter, police could enter common lodging houses without a warrant and without notice at all times of the day or night. This extraordinary police power itself had to be policed, as it was inconceivable that private houses could be dealt with in this way. The control of lodging houses thus presupposed the construction of a boundary, demarcating those persons and properties subject to unrestrained inspection. This was not an easy task. Parliament wrestled unsuccessfully with different definitions of common lodging houses in 7 different bills in the space of a decade. The inability statutorily to define lodging houses did not, however, as Tom Crook and others have pointed out, prevent certain houses with lodgers from being regulated. They were controlled under regulations produced by Whitehall rather than Parliament. In this case, some way of taxonomizing the poor was necessary. The housing of London's working classes was in general not good, but Parliament agreed that it was essential that the great body of the working poor be free from routine, unrestrained domestic inspections by the police. In the end, since many poor working folks rented their accommodations by the week, it was decided by the Home Office that rental for less than a week was one marker of a common lodger and thus of a common lodging house. But the emergence of these common lodging houses as the only houses with lodgers regulated at mid-century cannot be explained by class alone. The regulations stressed that what mattered was not just short-term accommodation, but short-term accommodation with non-family members, and the compulsory separation of the sexes, including children over 10 years old, over 10 years old, was a crucial new regulatory feature. The control of lodging houses thus illustrates, as Mary Poovey noted, the complex ways in which sex, class, health, and property intersected in the control of certain domestic spaces and in the simultaneous construction of an outcast group. And this is not the only example of the ways in which public health could be exclusive. The Contagious Diseases Acts are a slightly later notorious example. But along with the inclusive community of drainage beneficiaries described earlier, these exclusive publics remind us of the diversity of public making in the context of epidemic disease at this point in time. To turn very briefly to our present moment, as I watch the COVID crisis unfold, I see, like most historians, some dismaying similarities with the past, particularly in terms of the differential impact of COVID and its control on different groups of people. Now, as was the case with cholera in the 19th century, these impacts have triggered a vigorous public protest, currently amplified by the concurrent Black Lives Matter protests. The long-term significance of these protests remains to be seen, but it was encouraging yesterday to see the launch of a new initiative led by the former Labour Chancellor that is committed, among numerous other things, to the nationalization of care homes in the United Kingdom, thereby targeting one of the most egregious differential COVID impacts on staff and residents. In addition, in terms of measures of fiscal solidarity, debates analogous to the ones I encountered in the 19th century are being played out at the international level. Probably the situation I'm paying most attention to is the European Union, where COVID is giving the community a serious case of whiplash as it confronts intense centripetal and centrifugal pressures associated with coronavirus. To say that centrifugal tendencies predominated in the European Union's early response to coronavirus is uncontroversial. But as the bloc contemplates its recovery plan, especially the financial recovery package, a significant measure of fiscal solidarity has been agreed to. Whether the impulse that inspires that solidarity can ever move the needle in the direction of a wider international solidarity remains yet to be determined. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, James. Actually, I think that's going to provide a nice introduction and set of ideas to think about for Sarah's talk. So Sarah, we'll turn to you now.
Excellent, thank you. Good afternoon again, everyone. Over the past several months, the Trump administration has introduced different tactics aimed at containing the spread of the COVID-19 virus in the United States, such as setting up quarantine procedures at border points, funding research for a vaccine, and stockpiling personal protective equipment and ventilators. These steps are possible because the US federal government has the public health bureaucracy, budget, and authority needed to implement them. Unlike Europe, where most countries had strong national health frameworks in place by around the year 1850, Jacksonian democracy, styled on the desire of President Andrew Jackson that the states retain their power within a weakly centralized federal structure, kept Washington's involvement in health matters to a minimum until several decades later. Individual states tended to manage their own quarantine procedures, for example, and in fact, the last state-run quarantine station wasn't closed until 1921. Unfortunately, gaps between regional public health responses to epidemics helped facilitate the spread of infectious diseases throughout the 19th century. Malaria spread along the eastern seaboard from Florida to New England. Typhoid fever ravaged the South, and waves of cholera swept across the nation. Just as some Americans were beginning to realize the need for a more centralized response to disease outbreaks, the federal government's successes in combating 3 epidemics convinced many others of this point and helped bring about the expansion of the US Public Health Service, the main precursor of today's Department of Health and Human Services. The first major success of this nature occurred during the Spanish-American War in 1898. During this conflict, yellow fever, which was endemic to Cuba at that time, felled more US soldiers fighting on the island than battle injuries. The virus's etiology, or mode of transmission, had not yet been proven, but Major General William Gorgas, the Army's chief sanitation officer in Havana, decided to test the recently published theory of Cuban Dr. Carlos Finlay that the disease was spread by mosquitoes. So the Army treated cesspools around the island with gasoline and other chemicals, which together with wide-scale fumigation, killed the mosquito larvae and very quickly ended the epidemic. Unfortunately, by that time, nearly 2,000 US soldiers had died of the fever and other infectious diseases. This was a staggering number given that less than 400 were killed in fighting. But the containment of the virus at the end of the 3-month war was still seen as a major victory for the Army. By the following year, Gorgas's continued efforts had wiped out the disease entirely from Cuba for the first time in a century. The anti-mosquito campaign had also proved Finlay's theory about the etiology of yellow fever, which was a massive achievement in itself. The government soon repeated these efforts in the Central American country of Panama. In the 1880s, France had begun construction on an artificial waterway through the Isthmus of Panama, which would serve as a shortcut between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, saving vessels from having to go all the way around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America. But when waves of malaria and yellow fever killed over 20,000 workers, the project was halted until the US government acquired it in 1903. William Gorgas's triumph in Cuba earned him the prestigious peacetime appointment as Chief Sanitation Officer of the Canal Project. He was given the enormous task of battling both mosquito-borne viruses in the Panama Canal Zone. He immediately began to repeat his efforts in Cuba, but on a much larger scale, implementing a large sanitation campaign focused in the rural area around the canal site. His workers drained all pools of water near villages, treated stagnant water sources that couldn't be drained with oil and larvicide, distributed free quinine to every construction worker as protection against malarial infection, and hired Panamanian townsfolk to kill adult mosquitoes in buildings. Collectively, these steps led to a dramatic drop in new malaria and yellow fever cases and allowed the canal to be built and ultimately opened by 1914. Gorgas's accomplishment in Panama was lauded in newspapers across the United States, But thousands of Americans saw the results of his efforts for themselves when they took some of the first sea voyages through the waterway. These successes on the international stage were followed by one at home. Just as the canal was opening, the US Public Health Service was wrapping up a wide-scale 5-year campaign to end a hookworm epidemic that was plaguing the United States South. By the early 20th century, as many as 40% of Southerners carried the hookworm parasite, which affects the small intestine, causing severe, often fatal anemia in its victims. It is generally spread when infected fecal matter comes into contact with bare feet, which happened frequently in impoverished communities throughout the 9 southern states where hookworm was most prevalent. The US Public Health Service, the national agency responsible for managing disease outbreaks until the establishment of the Centers for Disease Control in 1946, was aware of the problem but didn't have the funding to solve it. However, in 1909, federal bacteriologist Charles W. Stiles secured a grant of $1 million from the charitable fund of oil tycoon John G. Rockefeller to finance a 3-pronged joint campaign between the government and the Rockefeller Foundation. Stiles' workers first mapped out areas of infection in each state. Next, they opened mobile labs where they tested the fecal matter of people suspected of having the disease and offered free treatment to those who had the parasite. The cure was taken in 2 steps. First, the patient had to drink a solution made from the herbs of thyme or male fern, which would kill the worms. And then the patient had to wash it down with Epsom salts, which would detach the ova or eggs from the intestine. As you can imagine, this was unpleasant to take, but it was extremely effective, and many thousands were cured this way. The final and most important step was educating the public on how to avoid infection and reinfection. Other than advising people to always wear shoes outdoors, this also involved instructing them on how to build proper outhouses, as inside flushing toilets were not available to most Southerners at this time. Also, free public lectures on the symptoms, mode of transmission, and treatment of the parasite were given throughout the South. But the most effective educative tool turned out to be the microscope. At county fairs, adults and children could view slides of hookworm ova, which for many people drove home the need to get checked and, if needed, cured. The 5-year campaign did not fully eradicate hookworm in the United States. This wouldn't happen until around the 1950s, but it did reduce it dramatically. And as importantly, many states began to follow the project's example by investing significant money significantly more money in hookworm eradication and other public health measures than they ever had before. I'll conclude by mentioning that the legacy of these and other federal public education efforts is seen today in the ongoing American fight to contain COVID-19. A key example is how the scientists of the Centers for Disease Control and Dr. Anthony Fauci of the Trump administration's COVID task force have, at least until recent weeks, been given a platform and a voice for communicating best practices to limit the spread of the virus. Many of these recommendations have been adopted by individual states, especially northern ones, and their municipalities. Thank you very much for listening. It's been great to have the opportunity to prepare this talk.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Something I know very little about, so I'm learning as we go here. Mitchell, can I ask you to start your presentation?
Hello.
Hi, Mitchell. I still can't see you.
Here I am.
There we
Hello.
are. There we are.
Okay,
Perfect.
so
Thank
I'm
you.
all set. So hello, everyone. And first of all, thank you very much to Esselt and her team for coordinating these marvelous roundtables, and also for the Canadian Society for the History of Medicine for their support and for hosting the videos. As I get started for this virtual presentation, I just want to very quickly acknowledge the physical space where I am, and in particular the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory my university, University of Victoria, stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship with that land continues to this day. So I would like to briefly consider some issues that are familiar to historians of medicine, but with an eye to the issue of pandemics and their public or publics. And my approach has also been guided by an issue that I think recurred in some of the earlier presentations, and that is the issue of trust and of public trust and of the desire to find a public consensus for proceeding when faced with a public health crisis. I'm now going to share some slides on my screen. We'll just bear with me while I activate this. There we go. So as we experience COVID-19, we are asking ourselves and seeing in different experiences around the world how this question is being pursued in different ways. What is the foundation for a public consensus or for public trust in public health agents? And more fundamentally, how is a pandemic public created? And as I'll discuss briefly, I would say that pandemic publics are created partly by instruments of communication and partly by conceptual tools for imagining diseases in individuals and populations. And so I want to pursue the question of how our contemporary notion of pandemics has taken shape. So how did we get here, essentially? And what I have here on the screen for you to see is one view of the British Columbia COVID-19 dashboard, which I think has its similar dashboards have been mounted by other provinces and by other agencies in the United States and elsewhere. And this becomes a public health tool. It also becomes a way that that people like me participate indirectly in a crisis that I'm very keenly aware for many is personal and painful in a way that it is not for me. But in providing this information that we see here on the dashboard, we can see that this presentation of information relies on several premises. One simple premise is that COVID cases of disease can be counted, and that morbidity and mortality can be charted. It's possible to confirm who has the disease and who doesn't. It's possible also to compare across regions or even continents to see what's happening in different parts of the world, indeed with remarkable specificity, looking in on remotely on the most remote regions of the world about which one might not have any personal experience, but which you can track different kinds of data. And also linked to this is the simple fact that data are available from different places at the same time, and that our notion of what a pandemic is rests on this state of affairs. Well, it's very clear that if we jump backward 100 years or 150 years, certainly the range of assumptions that are embedded in this dashboard certainly did not apply for most of Western history, certainly, or for that matter, for people elsewhere around the world. And so, very broadly speaking, until just over a century ago, and obviously this took shape rather gradually over time, but disease through most of human history has reflected an exchange or an interplay between individual bodies and the outer world. And this interplay, of course, has been visualized and understood in many different ways. In the 19th century, there was focus on individual qualities, the qualities of individual bodies, the predispositions or the temperaments of unique people, and also the sanitary habits of unique people, which influenced why some people fell ill and others did not. And moreover, the course of disease varied, and that as one's body engaged with the disease-causing forces, which were variously understood, the course of the disease would be different for each individual person. Second, environments influenced bodies in diverse ways, and local environments were relevant, whether or not they were characterized, to use the preferred term of 19th century London, whether they were filthy environments or salubrious environments, or whether different climates were involved, tropical climates versus non-tropical climates being an essential distinction. And then certainly in the years around 1840 and then before, there were efforts to reconcile the idea, various concepts of miasmas or clouds, an effort to reconcile this with more material concepts of spread and poisons, and also to deal more consistently with the problem of counting, figuring out who had diseases and what the criteria for those diseases were. And particularly officials in mid-19th century London, such as William Farr, people in this milieu took the lead in trying to deal with this problem of counting. So this is a basic kind of rough outline of how things were before the later 19th century. And I'm now going to discuss three different areas that I think are very important and kind of intrinsic to our current notions of what a pandemic is. The first is that starting in the 1870s and 1880s, for the first time, we had a wired world. We had the potential for immediate communication about disease as well as other things. And this changed the way that diseases were visualized. Before the late 19th century, outbreaks of diseases such as cholera or plague, the great sort of frightening pestilences of that time, were described as waves that moved from place to place. And cholera was certainly the paradigm here, that it swept out of India in recurrent waves, and it could be tracked by observers as it moved week by week across vast regions. But this then changed, or there was a potential for change, at least with regard to some diseases, with the introduction of telegraph, which enabled observation of simultaneous independent spread of disease around the world, which is very much a basic notion of what a pandemic is. It's independent spread in different places around the world. It's possible to have this conception of disease once technology enables people to actually simultaneously observe, or more or less in real time observe this. And I'm indebted to Mark Humphrey's work for sort of pointing this out and bringing this to light in his research on influenza and other diseases. Second, at roughly the same time, there were new concepts of the causal origins of disease. In particular, between 1876 and 1884, research that was led by Robert Koch and different teams in Berlin and elsewhere linked the activity of microbes to diseases, notably anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. And so focusing on a very, very particular set of relationships and on the activity of microbes that were living beings. And so this shifted the conversation dramatically, of course, about the causes of disease. And what's particularly interesting for our discussion of publics is that Koch was set apart not just because of the scientific work that he was doing, but because of the media attention that he received. He was one of the first global scientific superstars. We could think of him, although in a very different field, as the Stephen Hawking of his day. Instead of astronomy, it was public health. It was possible for people to learn of Robert Koch with a speed that was not possible even for Louis Pasteur some decades earlier. He was a younger or an older contemporary of Koch. And Koch himself recognized that his own actions to represent and depict pathogens had an element of persuasion, and he was indeed the first person to photograph bacteria and to show their life cycle. And he placed great emphasis on the role of photography as a piece of evidence that would conclusively demonstrate the existence and ultimately the action of pathogens. And so Koch went from being a relatively obscure scientist to, within a few years, vaulting into international fame, to the point to where a decade later, it's not just the New York Times, but it's the Spokane Press, even local newspapers being very interested in the prospect of some of the worst scourges of human history perhaps being conquered by this new knowledge. And of course, the effect also on human behavior. And many of us have reflected on the conventions of the early 20th century and how some of those conventions have returned during our COVID experience. Awareness of personal habits. During the influenza pandemic of 1918, wearing masks, having social awareness, and even practicing forms of social distancing, as you see depicted here in this ad for disinfecting tablets by Formament. And I especially like this image because it shows advertising playing a public health educating function, albeit for commercial purposes, but basically educating people by depicting germs, or germ life as it's called, with these nice little petri dishes. So in addition to these new conceptions of disease and the simultaneity of communication, a third aspect of this was that the claim of Western science was that this approach to communicable disease was universal, that essentially diseases were the same everywhere. And this was based not just on research in European laboratories, but also research in Africa, among African animals, and indeed among African people. This was done with research on the devastating cattle disease rinderpest, also performed on the disease sleeping sickness, spread by tsetse flies, which has different forms that affects livestock, wild animals, and humans. And this research was performed in places that Europeans would have considered very much out of the way, notably on in the islands of Lake Victoria, the Sisi Islands, where Robert Koch and others were able to perform experiments with the peoples of that region that never would have been approved and never would have been deemed remotely acceptable in a European context. Work by Koch and others in this colonial context emphasized certain dimensions of germ theories and public health practices that we will readily recognize today as being significant. That germs spread similarly in humans and animals, and that it was the presence of a pathogen rather than manifestation of symptoms that revealed the presence of disease. This was one of the fundamental claims that Koch was already making in 1882 with his research on tuberculosis. Second, although germ behavior was consistent, populations could vary in susceptibility because of hygiene differences or because of innate physiological qualities. So just because the dynamics of the spread of germs were universal did not mean that all people were the same. Indeed, there became different criteria for examining people's behavior, as we'll talk about in a second. Third, Koch refined ideas that others, including Pasteur, had earlier of a notion of a carrier state, That is, that germs might live in people either before or after they manifested symptoms, and that germs indeed might be transmissible when people were not obviously sick. And of course, this has been a question that's been very, very energetically debated for COVID-19, the extent of asymptomatic transmission. This was an idea that was very actively refined in the first decade, the first years of the 20th century. And then finally, Koch and others tested the utility of population-based test and treat approaches to epidemics. And the idea was to intervene, not necessarily to cure or to treat, but to intervene in ways that halted the spread of disease. And so it was sometimes thought, especially for African bodies, that it was too late to halt the destructive impact of the disease for a sick person, but it might be possible to make that sick person unable to spread the disease to other people. And that was part of the method for administering very high doses in some instances of toxic chemicals. And so these ideas about the universality of disease, the carrier state, and so on, these ideas were carried back to Europe, as Christoph Gradmann has pointed out, in particular the notion of the carrier state, quote, facilitated a concept of infected individuals as a threat to society that needed to be dealt with through isolation and control. And with the identification of microbes, soon came the use of blood tests to confirm or disprove the existence of infection. Tests of this kind were developed for typhoid, for syphilis, for other diseases as well. And many are familiar with the case of the so-called typhoid Mary, Mary Mallon, who refused to be tested for typhoid, but eventually was forcibly confined to North Brother Island in Long Island Sound after it was shown that she was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. And the case of Mary Mallon illustrated how a novel concept of disease transmission could be imposed upon lay people for whom this was a completely novel idea. In addition, such blood tests and other kinds of tests were administered in colonial settings. And Sarah already referred to Panama, also at the same time the Philippines, where the Spanish-American conflict in the first years of the 1900s brought U.S. public health and military authorities into alliance in disparate contexts around the world. And in these contexts, Panama and the Philippines concern shifted from the unhealthy tropical environments to unhealthy bodies and to unhealthy practices. And it was the use of blood tests that was able to confirm, or at least in the mind of public health officials, confirm the existence of these diseases and their presence among colonial peoples. And so a shift took place towards looking at the behavior of colonial peoples rather than the overall environment where colonial peoples lived. So perhaps we can pull back now as I start to close here and consider how these aspects of pandemics that took shape in the early 20th century, how then these get reflected back into our circumstances today. One way in which they show up is in a visualization that we're all familiar with, the visualization of flattening the curve, which is of relatively recent vintage. The best research that I've seen on this suggests that it was at the Centers for Disease Control in 2007 that it was first done, and then quite recently it was animated by another public health expert, I believe in New Zealand, Susie Wiles, who animated, basically created a GIF for flattening the curve, which is depicted here. And this concept of flattening the curve has been a very, very powerful vehicle for focusing public health concerns and to link collective well-being of individuals, or link collective well-being to the capacity of health systems, and to say, well, we're all in this together for supporting the integrity and the capacity of our healthcare system, which is the point of flattening the curve. But we can readily see that this notion of flattening the curve or stretching out the incidence of disease, this is already intimately linked to assumptions that were rooted in this late 19th, early 20th century approach to communicable disease that took shape. And in our current circumstances, this streamlined public health message, flattening the curve, the use of statistics, the comparative dimension of things like the dashboards that we see that show us different circumstances around the world, these carry with them certain challenges that people have reflected on in different ways over the last few months in particular. One question is, how do we take account of the diversity among populations in ways that neutrally address variation, rather than constructing racial or socioeconomic differences? How also do we take into account the diversity of individual experiences among what could be referred to as cases of COVID-19, incidences of this disease? Because confirmation that one has the virus, that the virus has entered a person's body, does very little to explain what its personal and social impact might be in the short term or the long term. And we're increasingly aware of the vast diversity of experiences of people's engagement with COVID-19 once they fall ill. And then finally, what kind of information do we need to foster and to disseminate that will contribute to a constructive or inclusive public health response, and to make what's a banal and obvious point that perhaps nonetheless is appropriate here. The internet creates both opportunities and pitfalls for us in our efforts to create a public health consensus. And so to conclude, the communication tools and concepts of pandemic are interrelated. How we communicate affects our notion of how disease is affecting our world. And lay people only have the kind of pandemic that their communications infrastructure enables them to have. Additionally, publics of different kinds are created by theories of disease, as well as communications technology. And then finally, I think a challenge that we're wrestling with is that germ theory-based approaches to disease, which are dominant for thinking about COVID-19, and logically so, they must also account for human diversity, and that this was, in different ways, a task that was actually performed more richly by disease concepts before circa 1880 than after. So that's my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mitch. Can we just make sure that we turn your screen sharing off?
Yes, okay.
Great.
So I think that's off. And
Perfect.
then shall I mute myself now?
No, we're going to have some discussion now.
Okay.
So leave your microphone on. So I'll open it up for the next few minutes to discussion between the panelists. James, your video is muted.
Sorry.
Are you okay there?
Yeah,
there
sorry.
we go. Does anyone want to start? Or I have a couple of interesting things to say, but I don't have to say them. So go ahead, you guys. How about if I start with James, since he started off the presentations as well? Oh, and as I should say that as we're doing this, if you want to, audience members, if you want to send in a question, we can't get to all of them, but we try, without being here for too long, to get to some of them. So you can send your questions in through the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Esselt, and thanks to my two fellow panelists for really fascinating presentations. I can't help but think about some of the aspects of pandemic or disease experience which seem so different in the earlier 19th century context that I work in, but which in fact are built right into the way in which people understood diseases and their impacts, especially statistics. And Mitch, while you were talking about the promise and perils, I guess, of how differential mortality data can be used both to understand and to stigmatize at the same time. And I think about how Chadwick used, some what we now think of as, lamentable data on average age of death, which is deeply problematic from a demographic standpoint, but incredibly powerful. And I still see those numbers cited in newspapers, and they were cited in newspapers then, and they have an existence that can't be crushed. So the power of these recording practices to construct populations and to analyze and taxonomize different kinds of populations is very powerful, and I thought that was a really interesting part of what you were saying.
I'll also apologize to the participants and to the listeners. It seems that there was feedback on my microphone, and perhaps it's better now if I'm holding it. So apologies if my voice was scraping along during my presentation. But James, you're absolutely right. And what's remarkable to me is that we see these dashboards and they look so official. They look so immaculate with their depiction of this data, and they're almost to the minute. We're getting it. And yet it's and this is separate from what I was saying in my talk, but that data is based on so many different kinds of testing regimes, who's being tested, when, and there's just so many variables to that, and yet we are being given that, and it's serving as a basis for so many decisions that people are making, and that even policymakers are making. And you see these charts, and it's just really remarkable to think about how partial our information is. It's a bit frightening. But it's the best we have, and it's maybe better than it was, but it's to some degree illusory how much we actually know.
I have something that I thought about, Sarah, when you were giving your talk about, I don't know, maybe irony isn't the right word, but the key role played by those southern states in building this kind of sense of the public health campaign in the US, and those same states now being the location of so much resistance to public health measures. And I don't know if that's a thought you've had or whether you want to reflect on that.
It's definitely occurred to me. But yeah, I don't think I have any sort of cogent comment other than anything larger than what you said. So yeah, ironic.
Is it? I just a quick follow-up. So do you know how the public perceived those campaigns at the time? Do we have any insight into that?
If we're speaking specifically about how the public perceived the hookworm campaign, which I can speak to a bit, certainly there was a lot of resistance to, for many people, the idea that as many as half of all Southerners were possibly infected with hookworm. It did make a lot of sense to those who looked at people in the South of both major races and thought, well, it's attributed more to the lethargy that they're seeing as laziness or something like that, inherited, and it was very difficult for people to think, well, actually it was a parasite causing a lot of the problems people had, especially in terms of making a living and having the energy to go on with their day. So at first there was a lot of resistance. I believe the campaign, that even though it was quite successful in many ways, at the end of it, the organizers wanted more money to reach more people. Perhaps some of these were the holdouts who refused to get tested and did see it as an impingement or infringing on their rights.
Sarah, I was just going to ask you, I'm aware that the Rockefeller Foundation was quite active in some of those hookworm initiatives. To what extent was the Rockefeller Foundation, or perhaps the U.S. Public Health Service, were they impacted by hookworm experiences in dealing with it in China? I know that it was also a challenge in China, and how did that? What was the interaction like with that?
So I know the focus when this campaign wrapped up, some of the data was already coming in that was informing this particular campaign was from the Rockefeller Foundation's work in Asia, where they were collecting data they were focusing on China, but also India as well, and collecting data on people who had hookworm infection. After this campaign wrapped up in the States, the focus then turned back to Asia in terms of deploying help and treatment and things like this, and funds were earmarked for this purpose. But the extent of that, I wouldn't be able to speak to. But it's a great point. Okay, yeah.
And Mitch, and Sarah, you know, you both kind of raised this issue of communication and legitimacy, I guess, of who is the communicator and how trust and consensus is built. And again, as I think about that in the context of the 19th century, and in Britain, at least, in England and Wales, and the extraordinarily partisan newspaper culture that existed at the time. I mean, I know we think that our media is hopelessly polarized, but you know, that stuff is like eye-wateringly polarized. Yet, there, you know, somehow people got elected who voted taxes to build a whole bunch of stuff that transformed the urban environment. And notwithstanding the skepticism with which people like Chadwick, you know, if there was ever a political communicator of information, it's him. The skepticism that attached as well to the medical profession, nonetheless, and I can't explain it, some kind of what I guess Martin Daughton sometimes calls trustworthy accountability was baked into the institutions, so that as long as there was seen to be kind of bureaucratic oversight, there was some measure of continued willingness to invest in these transformative projects. It's such a fundamental question, and you know, it's kind of the problem of our moment.
Yeah, we have an audience question about trust. And you know, the fact that some of your presentations focused on public education, evidence, and building trust. So the question, I think, is trying to get at, you know, how do you do that building of trust? And is it partly about recognizing that some people who lack trust might have legitimate reasons for lacking trust? But it's also interesting what you're saying, James, about this. Not part of it is about communication. It seems quite clear from everyone's talks, but part of it is also about the nature of the institutions themselves that are promoting, you know, certain public health campaigns. So, yeah, I don't know. Is it? How do we deal with that issue of people having legitimate issues with trust? Somebody jump in.
Well, gosh, I think about this with the it is an issue of, I mean, for me, it's also the challenges to legitimacy are coming from more than one place, and some of them are coming from at least, you know, in North America more broadly, you know, questioning legitimacy of governing institutions in general. But then there's also the challenge to legitimacy of sort of of scientific reasoning, and how does someone connect scientific reasoning to their personal experience? And for me, the anti-vaccination concerns is an example where once in a great while people are harmed by vaccines, and I think it's very difficult for public health people to acknowledge that once in a great while, that minimal and yet, you know, ever-present risk, because when they do, it gives rise to people overstating what that risk is, or viewing the trade-off between individual and collective benefit in different ways. Because from a public health standpoint, the idea is, well, if 3 million people are spared from a disease and that will never get it, and one person dies or is you know, disabled for life because of an adverse, you know, effect, from a population standpoint, that's a good trade-off. But if you're that one person, how then, what happens to you? And then, almost more importantly, how do you then how does that get acknowledged that bad thing happened to you? And I think that kind of fear is something that animates a lot of the anti-vaccination things, and it's very difficult because I don't think within science, there's a good answer to that kind of question of the great public benefit being served, and yet the individual public, or the individual good being tragically not served.
And as an historian of science, which is how I kind of began this life, I can't think of people worse placed to try to come up with some way to justify the legitimacy of expertise. I mean, the whole history of science is a story of provisional truth, if you even want to call it that. And it's very hard to try to smooth over the realities of wrong roads taken and with very destructive effects, and persuade people, but this time, this is really what we have to do. And I feel quite stymied by thinking about that. I'm perfectly happy to trust various people, but I'm acutely conscious of how fragile even my own sense of confidence is.
We have another question, which shifts the conversation a little bit to the question of our perception of how long pandemics or epidemic outbreaks last. So, maybe I'll just read part of it out loud. There's a wide availability of information, including data sets where the general public sees the ebbs and flows of case counts, tend to cause the public to think of pandemics as short-lived, rather than viewing them as good and bad years of outbreaks in a context of years or decade-long struggles with diseases, like cholera is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
So do we think people are starting to think of of a pandemic that is like just really short? And is this a new thing, or is it something different? Any reflections on that?
Well, I can just maybe mention one thing, and that is that I think one concept that has really taken hold in popular kind of understandings of things is the idea of pandemic waves. And I think that one reason for that, and as perhaps you as well could comment on this, I think that the experience of flu in 1918, with the well-known fact that flu occurred in waves, and that other pandemics have successively, gone through waves, circulating globally around the world as our networks now enable them to do. That this is an idea that has taken hold, and I think that there was talk of, well, this is the ebbing of the first wave kind of thing, and like we've got to brace for a new wave in the fall. And but people are trying to plug something in that perhaps isn't a legitimate thing to plug in. There's sort of wishful thinking around, oh, well, maybe there's a seasonal component and it's going to wane in the summer, and then we're going to have another wave in the fall. And you look at the case counts now, and it's manifestly obvious that in some parts of the world, at least, there wasn't a wave. There was a mild ebbing as people really put their minds to doing public health practices. And then as soon as they stopped, the cases went right back up again. It's just a question of suppressing, like a forest fire. It's like either you're pouring water on the fire or you're not, and it's either going to keep roaring up or it's not, depending on what you're doing, as opposed to there being some kind of biologically driven wave that's going on. So I think that's something that where people are still getting used to. And obviously I'm a layperson and I shouldn't maybe go too far in this direction, but people are getting used to the idea that this is something that isn't going away, and that perhaps the good news of that is that we really do have some of that destiny in our hands, is that we have a continual threat, and that we have to keep at it. But the endurance required to do that, you can just see our public health officials trying to manage expectations and try and nurse us along to keep going as long as possible kind of stick with it, stay with it. And it's so hard to do because people's just their endurance necessarily flags, including people who are suffering because they are unemployed or just facing all sorts of personal challenges.
Well,
And
that question of waves, sorry, just 2 secs, James, that the comparison between flu and COVID is really, it breaks down more and more all the time, right? So the idea of the waves, there's also a lot of confusion about what the waves during the flu 1918, 1920 flu pandemic were. And so people think that, so I've been talking about the second wave over and over again, even though, do you know what I mean? So people are looking for the next wave, but they're thinking that it's going to look like the second wave in the fall of 1919. But these comparisons start to break down. And I think that's all totally normal. And I think it's just people want to have some sense of what's coming next. But, you know, disease isn't really, it's not really like that. And we're learning as we go along, as people did in the past. But James, you wanted to jump in.
No, not necessarily. I don't want to preempt if Sarah wants to say anything, but, you know, I wonder not just in how some particular pandemic is perceived, but, you know, at what point, and maybe it's unrealistic to even hope that this might happen, that the sequences of these new epidemics, emerging diseases, whatever term one wants to use, you know, my impression is that the concept that this has been for the somewhat recent past an ongoing problem, and it's going to be an ongoing problem in the, you know, not very far into the future, and how that might eventually change how people respond to some new instance of what gets called a pandemic.
I think even going back to plague, and we think about all the books that are written about plague, and there's very often a narrative that's built into it, a narrative of rise and fall. And people I think very badly want to, understandably so, want to see that, or they want to see it in terms of their local community, if not for everyone. And I think the hard reality that perhaps we have to get used to with COVID is that it's going to be very patchy, and that it's not going to be a collective experience of rise and fall. That there's not going to be a narrative that fits everybody, and that everybody's going to be going through different things at different times. And that's one of the things that makes a coordinated response very difficult, along with the fact that COVID has a differential impact on people by age and health status. So that you know, it's hard. I mean, I guess because it moved around so fast, there hasn't been this, you know, too much of the, you know, targeting of different ethnic or, you know, so even socioeconomic groups as there might have been, because it seems to show the potential to affect everybody. And so that's a good thing, if we could use that terminology.
Well, we're coming up on 4:15, and I usually try not to let it go on too much more than an hour and 15 minutes. But I really, I want to give everyone, if any of you have a last comment that you want to make, please feel free to do so. But I want to thank everybody first for taking the time, especially Sarah, who has how old is your daughter, right? How old is she?
9 months.
9 months. She has a 9-month-old. So I really appreciate her sharing her work with us in the middle of the day. And just to say, if no one has any last comments, we're going to take a bit of a hiatus from Pandemic Histories for the month of August. There's really a lot of ongoing interest in it, so I have to say that this is purely out of my own selfishness. I need to get a rest in here somehow. But we're going to reconvene in early fall, and at the moment we're working on a panel on global health perspectives on COVID. So like usual, the recording will be posted on the Canadian Society for the History of Medicine website. And we will probably email everyone when the time comes to let them know when we're getting going again. So thanks, everyone.
Well,
Am I missing
thank you,
anything?
Essel.
Yeah,
Thank
it was
you very
really
much.
great to chat with all of you.
And both of you as well, James and Sarah, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure.
Okay, have a good remainder of your day, everybody.
You too. Thank
Take
you.
care, stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.